Yeah, I mean, COVID-19 really threw the restaurant industry for a loop here in the United States. We're estimated to see about 1 in 3 restaurants close permanently. We've already seen hundreds of restaurants close in every community. Those that have stayed open during the pandemic, those restaurants that have stayed open during the pandemic have really learned to pivot and deliver food in a different way. They've become community centers, they've become feeding centers for the food insecure, they've done takeout, delivery, cocktails to go, anything you can possibly think of, they've done.
And they've really had to do this. We've had to adapt because the pandemic really has shown us how vulnerable, how unfair our food systems are. How did we get to this point and where did we go wrong?
Yeah, I mean, our food systems, we've always said that our food system worked just fine for what it was supposed to do. Cheap, fast food for the majority of people, right? COVID laid waste to that food system. We had food shortages all over the country. We saw a real breakdown in the supply chain. It also brought to light the inequities in pay and benefits, and the inequities in who owned and who could get access to additional capital to stay alive. So about 1 in every 6 restaurants in the U.S. is owned by a person of color, but they were less than 30% of the federal aid that was dispensed. So we really saw that the overwhelming federal aid that came in the form of loans and grants went predominantly to white restaurants, white-owned restaurants. And so you just saw the COVID-19 pandemic just laid waste to our food supply chain in the United States. It really decimated our restaurants in the United States. And in part, it was because there was no backup. There was no aid available other than loans. There were no grants. There was no wage guarantee, no benefit guarantee. And so it's not even an existential crisis. It's a crisis of survival for the industry.
Right. And now because of this crisis, we are reimagining, rethinking our food systems. There's an important UN summit coming up this year, but also at a more local level, chefs and restaurant owners themselves are trying to play a part in that, aren't they? Can you just tell us a little bit about the role that they're playing in trying to improve things going forward?
Well, I mean, one of the bright spots of COVID-19 for chefs and restaurants and even for our food system has been a reimagining of and a reinvestment in local and regional food, especially here in the United States, where things travel hundreds of miles to get to the plate. The chefs and restaurants really had to look closer to home. We saw them building partnerships with farmers, building partnerships with local fishermen. So there was a real reinvestment in local and regional food systems here in the U.S., and it's a bright spot from the pandemic. As we look forward to the UN meeting and also the development of our next farm bill here in the United States, chefs and restaurateurs have really stood up and tried to work with farmers, work with the local and regional food advocates to design new policies and to put forth new priorities that support it both financially and system-wide.
So you mentioned earlier that the way that our food system was run was making it cheap, affordable. It was all done on a large scale. So now as we try and rebuild all of this, where does big agriculture fit in? Is there a role for monocultures? Is there a role for chemicals? Is there a role for big agriculture at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are now in a world of and plus, right? We're always going to need large-scale agriculture. I mean, the need for grains and flours and cereals and all of these at mass scale. But when the supply chain broke at the beginning of the pandemic here in the United States, all of a sudden your grocery store was the one out of meat and chicken and fresh vegetables. Your local grocer or your local farmer's market, they had plenty. Right? And so you saw this redirection of it, and we all learned that you can figure out a balance, you can figure out a way to have, you can figure out a way to balance it, right? Because there's big ag's not going away. We have to figure out how to work with them, how to push them to change their purchasing policies, their animal policies, but they're not going away. And so what was exciting about COVID-19 in relation to big ag or local was that people rediscovered their local farmers market. They rediscovered how they could work with farmers to buy things. And it really has helped shine a new light on that as a possibility to expand.
Can you also comment on the role of Indigenous communities or Indigenous crops and how they've emerged through all of this much more unscathed than the rest of us, and have really shown us how it should be done? They've emerged as an example of what to do, what not to do.
Yeah, I mean, our BIPOC and Indigenous communities have really showed us how if we invest locally, we invest in regenerative agriculture policies and procedures, we really take the time to cultivate the soil and treat the animals well, you can eat off the land. You can eat from your community in a way that is very different than I think Americans typically imagine it. We think of our food system as a red barn with large silos and open fields and beautiful black and white cows, and that's not our reality. And our reality is either large-scale monocultures or large-scale animal production, or it's looking at how Indigenous farmers, Indigenous ranchers deliver things in a different way. A great example of like a big success story in terms of a reintroduction is actually the Northern Pacific salmon community, which is largely controlled by tribal and native communities, and they deliver a beautiful product, and people were able to rediscover them. They're also seasonal. You can only get salmon when the salmon are ready. So it's just a different way of thinking and a different way of not always, I think COVID also taught us we can't always have everything we want exactly when we want it, right? And we have to learn to adapt and change, and the same is true of our food system.
Katherine Miller, thanks so much for speaking to Radio France International.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great.